Matt Flynn was an Irishman working in Zomba at the time who had the worst golf swing I've ever seen. It was so flawed, it was embarrassing to watch. Sorry, Matt. Apparently, Matt had been a very good golfer at some point, and he was the nicest bloke. And it was Matt who suggested I do a master's degree in education at Manchester University in England, where he had done his. In early 1982, I was getting bored, beginning to wonder, well, what was I going to do after I left Malawi? It was vintage, green is greener Nixon stuff. I was in a good school, in a perfect climate, friendly people on all sides, and all I wanted to do was leave. Well, I even got the government, actually, of the Republic of Ireland to give me a grant to go to Manchester University. I have to say, that was an extraordinarily generous act. The sort of thing that just doesn't happen nowadays in our unromantic world. In April '92, I went to the travel agent in Blantyre to get my ticket to go home. And something happened which changed my life forever. Instead of finishing my journey from Malawi in London, the little Indian travel agent offered me a one-way ticket from London to Calgary. He offered me the ticket from Blantyre to London and then on to Calgary as an extension, free. It was some travel agent deal thing. Anyway, I took advantage of it to get a free ride to Calgary from London, should I wish to do that in the future. The ticket was valid for another year, September 1983. Over a year later, I did in fact travel to Calgary from London. Anyway, that's in the future. So in August, I left Malawi and went back to Belfast via London. Soon, on a rainy day, I was on my way to Manchester in Mum's little red mini car, which I'd bought off her, purchased it. I drove there to Manchester via the Larne Stranraer ferry, thinking this was an awfully long journey. Wasn't really. It was about 7 or 8 hours. Anyway, I stayed in a university residence called Moberly Tower and for postgraduate students from overseas. The lectures and seminars at Manchester were really variable. Some were top class and others were disappointing. One seminar contained a bunch of Nigerian oil bureaucrats who had obviously been sent by their government on the program. Although pleasant enough outside of class, all Africans are charming. They were actually mostly loud and arrogant inside class and didn't allow other people to speak in class discussions. I was not impressed. I was a great Ghanaian Africophile, having been in Ghanaian. These were the first Africans that I didn't really like. Some of my fellow students were interesting. The English ones from the north, Malcolm and Terry, were nicknamed the Seal and the Badger, respectively because they looked like these animals. I used to eat regularly with the seal and the badger in the canteen in the evenings. I never found out my own nickname, but I'm sure they had an appropriate one, something to take me down a peg or two. The opinionated little Irish nerd that they undoubtedly thought I was at the time. Terry was a socialist, the left-wing type, a great supporter of Tony Benn. It was the Margaret Thatcher era, and during my stay there, she was re-elected, defeating Michael Foot, the intellectual but not very pragmatic nor effective socialist leader. I was friendly with an Irish priest who had been a deputy principal in Hong Kong. I also became friendly with a little Mexican guy who was studying statistics. I met him in the TV room one night while he was watching the news. I think he invited me back to his room for coffee. He was very friendly, and this was my first introduction to Mexican charm. Through his friendship, I soon became interested in learning to speak Spanish. And of my own volition, I bought myself a little book of Spanish grammar and exercises for primary school. And I did these exercises religiously on a daily basis. Not for very long, mind you, half an hour or 45 minutes. Luis marked them, and in the evening gave me some conversation practice in his room over a cup of coffee. He also started to talk about Mexico and Mexican poets and writers. I became fascinated by Latin America. At Christmas, I invited him to come to Belfast, and he had Christmas with my family. I then took him to Dublin and to meet my friends from my Trinity days. Back in Manchester, about halfway through the year, I began to wonder what was I going to do next. That's always the problem for me. I applied for several jobs with the United World Colleges and came close, I think anyway, but just fell short of getting interviews for any of them. This was very frustrating. I really wanted to work in these international colleges because they had students from all over the world. I think they had Prince Charles at the time as a patron. The whole thing was a kind of theoretical idea to get people from all over the world. I think 1 or 2 students in language college, 200 of them, post sixth form, and the academically, able students. It was a great idea, really, but it was that sort of romantic idea, because the world at that time in the early 80s was a romantic place, unlike today. Anyway, my friend came up with a solution to my problem, because he said he invited me to stay with his family in Mexico so that I could really learn Spanish. So together with my one-way ticket to Calgary, if you remember, I had the perfect plan. I would fly to Calgary and then take the Greyhound bus through the United States to Mexico and stay with his family. That way I could become fluent in Spanish. In Manchester, though, that year was pretty uneventful, really, by my standards. In the second term, I thought I would try my hand at living on my own again, so I rented a room in a house of a guy called Ian, who I'd met at the university bar. He seemed quite a nice guy, but on closer acquaintance he turned out to be a bit fussy. One day he had a go at me in the new house about his greasy chip pan, or my greasy chip pan I should say. No doubt it was greasy, but not that greasy by my standards. Anyway, in the third term I moved back into Moberly Tower again. The little room that he rented me was the size of a matchbox, of course. Meanwhile, towards the end of the year, my Mexican friend started to behave a little oddly. He was mixed up with some strong religious sect called Opus Dei, and I soon formed the impression that he had a past history and some issues which he hadn't really entirely dealt with. He seemed tense at times and started to make rather personal, hurtful remarks even to myself. I became alarmed, and for a time I considered abandoning my trip to Mexico. In spite of his odd behavior, I went ahead with my trip to Calgary in September. I stayed with friends of my parents, Archie and Rita, and in Calgary this was a complete revelation. Rita didn't seem at all pleased to see me, although she was a great friend of my mum. Her son drove me around the place, told me in fact that his mother was quite annoyed with me because she thought that I was behaving as if I wanted to be treated like a king. Well, perish the thought. Anyway, I didn't think so. But then maybe I was. It might just have been me at that age. I don't know. Certainly I didn't think a lot of the North American idea of hospitality, which as far as I could see amounted to not much more than, there's the fridge, help yourself. In Ireland, the host feels responsible for the guest's comfort from the moment the guest enters the house until he leaves it, and the host is very attentive to the guest's every need. In Canada, it seemed not to be the same to me. Anyway, I stayed only a few days with the son, who showed me a few things, including a hedge under which on occasion he claimed he had slept at night. He always seemed to be trying to bring the conversation around to his conquests of women, which I found awkward, as I hadn't conquered any at that stage. I was 30, and I found his boasting pretty embarrassing. Anyway, I took the bus to Vancouver, and from there I caught a bus to San Francisco. It was a very long journey. We crossed the border at Seattle between Canada and the US, and I had a very difficult time. The Greyhound bus was held up for half an hour because of me. I was interrogated by immigration who were suspicious of my story. I suppose it was a little odd. I explained that I was on a one-way trip to a friend in Mexico in order to stay with him and learn Spanish. It was at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. To the immigration officer, I was an Irishman from Belfast with a one-way ticket into the US and an unlikely story about going to Mexico. The fact that I had a visa in Belfast was of absolutely no consequence to this officer. In the end, he reluctantly stamped my passport and let me in. The bus was held up for 20 minutes while I talked my way out of it. In the end, he almost spat out the words, "I do this with great reluctance," and he stamped my passport with a dramatic flourish. In San Francisco, I stayed at the YMCA and I went on a helicopter ride around San Francisco Bay. That's all I remember. Then I went to Los Angeles and stayed with my friend, an old friend from school days. He put me up in his Malibu home. He was a very successful musician on the LA scene. He was doing backup music for various groups. I remember asking him if I could accompany him to work, and I was very disappointed when he declined to let me join him. In retrospect, I was very naive to ask him. Like my mother's friend in Peachland, I was again being presumptuous and expecting far too much of people. This is a personality trait of mine which has got me into a lot of trouble, and still does. From LA, I headed east to Las Vegas and saw the Grand Canyon passing through Flagstaff. I hated Las Vegas. I arrived at 3 in the morning, walked up the strip just to say I had done it. How vain. And then took the bus out of the town again. From LA, I headed to Albuquerque to visit the United World College of the American West, one of those colleges I was talking about. This was part of my scheme to visit it on the way to Mexico. It was an IB school, of course, International Baccalaureate. Well, I had corresponded with this school and I was expecting the royal treatment from the principal. I thought he would be impressed by my dedication to the cause, travelling all this way just to visit his school. He barely glanced at me, and I shuffled off disconsolately, muttering to myself about the slings and arrows of misfortune. From Albuquerque, I travelled to a friend of my friend who lived on the US side of the border. Then I travelled to El Paso and took a bus to Mexico City. When I arrived in Mexico City, I stayed with my friend's sister, and my adventures really began.